Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Exploring New Income Streams webinar organised by the Church of Scotland Stewardship team. Tonight we will be focusing on missional approaches to broadening your congregation's income, and we hope you find it both informative and useful. My name is Fiona Penny. I'm one of the stewardship consultants, and I'm joined by my colleagues Darren Phillip, Catherine Southern, who will be presenting most of the information tonight, and our team leader, Pauline Wilson. Also joining us and available to help answer your questions are Anne McIntosh, our General Treasurer, Lisa Erskine, Congregational Finance Manager, and Brian Waller, Head of Policy and Legislation for the General Trustees. The presentation will last around 50 minutes, and then we will have some time for questions. So please do type your questions as we go along using the question and answer facility. We won't be using the chat function for questions, so if you tap or move your mouse until the toolbar appears at the bottom of your screen, you should see the Q&A icon. Click or tap on it, type your question and submit it. It's really encouraging to see over 250 people joining us tonight. We will try to answer everyone's questions, but if we do happen to run out of time, we will make sure that all the questions and answers are included in the follow-up information. If there are any very detailed questions, we may give you a general answer tonight and follow up with more detail by email. We've turned off all attendees' cameras and microphones as this event is being recorded so that it can be accessed and shared via our YouTube page. We will circulate the link when the video becomes available to everyone who registered, along with a copy of the slides, a further resources document, and a handout of all the questions and answers from tonight. The stewardship team are always keen to support you and your congregations in any way we can. And to help us do that, we would be very grateful if you could complete a short survey about this webinar and the kind of information that would be useful to you in the future. A link to the survey will be posted in the chat during the Q&A session, and if you click on it, it will take you directly to the survey. I think that's about all the housekeeping information for now. So let's get started as we come before God in prayer. Let's pray. Dear Lord, we thank you that technology has enabled us to gather from all over the country to learn, encourage, and support each other in the work of your church. As we look at different ways in which we might broaden our income, help us never to lose sight of the purpose behind all we do, to share the good news of the gospel, to make disciples, and to care for our world and those most in need. We pray that you will bless our time tonight and inspire us to foster a culture of mission and generosity in all aspects of our congregational life. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thanks so much, Fiona. So bear with me for just a moment here as I share my screen. Great. So I think Fiona touched on there, and I think many of us recognize that the church is in a period of transformation. Many congregations, I think, are entirely focused on just surviving in this new reality. But Jesus tells us that he doesn't just quench our thirst. He gives us a spring of water welling up to eternal life. When we follow Jesus, we don't just survive, but we thrive. So how then do we transform our own thinking from just survival mode to abundant and generous thinking about how we can advance our discipleship? How can we transform our attitudes about raising money so that it becomes not just a necessary activity that we do to keep the lights on, but rather an exciting and a transformative expression of discipleship? How can we make Christ known through our giving and our receiving of money? This webinar is really aimed at helping us start to think about some of these questions. We have three main goals for this session. The first is to help us start to look at our attitudes towards money in the church and understand how fundraising can act as a form of ministry and of discipleship. Second, we're going to look at some specific methods of generating income in a church context. And third, we're going to learn how to evaluate which forms of income generation may make sense for us, essentially to start to develop a strategy. I should say here that this is going to be quite a packed presentation. We're covering a wide scope of topics. I therefore want us to think about this as the first part of an ongoing conversation on the topic of income generation. We're going to be sharing a survey at the end, as Fiona mentioned, where you can share with us some of your thoughts about what further information and resources would be helpful. We're also going to be sharing a document with links to additional reading and resources related to the topics we discussed this evening. So we're going to start by talking a bit about our attitudes towards income generation within the church. From there, we're going to be talking, as I said, about some specific methods of generating income, along with some case studies. Then we're going to be talking about how we start to develop a strategy. And finally, we're going to open for some brief questions. I should clarify before going further that I'm going to be using the terms fundraising and income generation pretty interchangeably throughout this talk. But what I'm talking about is creating different sources of income for different church activities and how we steward our resources and our income. So, as I said, I want us to start by talking a bit about our attitude towards money within the church. I think that many of us can be very uncomfortable talking about money, in part because it's a taboo topic within society at large. But I think as well within the church, we can point to a lot of examples in the past of times when donations and offerings have been misused, looking at indulgences or televangelists, et cetera. So I think when we talk about money within the church, we approach it with an additional level of skepticism. However, I think we see in the New Testament that Jesus talks about money all the time, and that we should not be afraid to talk about it either. When we talk openly about money and how it's used to transform our communities, it makes the giving and the raising of money into a life-giving aspect of discipleship. I believe firmly that fundraising can be a form of mission, a way of transforming communities and helping to achieve God's vision for the world. It's a way of inviting people into our shared vision for the kingdom of God. Rather than begging, I think we should see fundraising as a way of declaring that we have an amazing vision and that we are inviting others to invest themselves into the work that God has called us to do. I think you'll find that a recurring theme throughout this webinar is that money follows vision and not the other way around. So when we start from the premise of just making money, of just surviving, we won't succeed. But when we start with a vision of a thriving and an abundant community, then that money is much easier to find. I think as well, we sometimes have this idea that it's better to simply keep quiet about money and only bring it up when it really becomes an issue. But when we do that, money becomes transactional rather than transformational. So what do I mean by this? A transactional way of looking at money is when we see giving as a necessary but ultimately unpleasant and distasteful exchange. But a transformational way of looking at money is when we recognize that giving and fundraising are vital to our discipleship. So, for example, when we look at money through a transactional lens, we might say, please, could you give us something because times have been really hard lately? But a transformational way of looking at it is to say, we have an exciting and an amazing vision for our church, and we would love for you to help us get there. Or similarly, if we have a transactional view of money, we might think everyone needs to give because it is our obligation as Christians. And while I do think that that's absolutely true, a more transformative way to think about it is to think that it is a privilege and a gift when we are able to support the work of the church. In a transactional mindset, we simply take money and we don't follow up with people to thank them or let them know how their money has been used. But if we want to be transformational, then we put time and effort into showing people how their gifts have impacted our work and our communities. And finally, when we think about money transactionally, we're focused on getting money in just ASAP. But a transformational way of looking at money is when we see income generation as a vital and an ongoing part of our ministry. Thinking about money in this way has a number of advantages. First, it creates a more secure financial position for our churches, meaning that we can fully live out our mission and provide stability for the people who benefit from the work that we do. Second, it provokes change and collaboration in our communities and requires us to grow and to evolve to meet the needs of a transforming world. It gives us language as well to connect with more unchurched people. So I think for people who are uncomfortable or unfamiliar with the language of the church, the language of the marketplace provides a new way of understanding the gospel's call to service. I think as well as we, the people asking for money, we have to recognize that our ultimate trust and our ultimate security is in God. When we see that, then we don't have to be afraid of people telling us no. I think as well, approaching money in this way models a way of relating to money that requires our money and our mission to be aligned. And finally, when we think about money in this way, it helps to build communities and build new and lasting relationships. I want to conclude this section with a quote from one of my favorite authors, Henry Nouwen. He says, "If we raise funds for the creation of a community of love, we are helping God build the kingdom. We are doing exactly what we are supposed to do as Christians." So now we're going to turn our attention to going through some different methods of income generation with examples from churches who are doing them in practice. We're going to start by talking about more traditional forms of giving and how we strengthen those. And then we're going to turn to talk about some new and potentially innovative methods. I have to say, this is not an exhaustive list. And again, if you're interested in any of the topics we talk about, then please let us know and we can do deeper dives on them at a later date. So as I said, I wanted to start by talking about traditional forms of giving, i.e. offerings and donations. I think giving by congregation members is still the foremost and the most important way that we raise money as a church. And therefore, we need to look at this before we turn our attention to other activities. We also need to look at how easy it is for people to give to us, because this forms the foundation of all of our other stewardship activities. So as I said, first, we need to be thinking about how easy it is for people to give to us. And I think the first step is to ensure that we have a time of offering during worship. I like to share the story of the time that my mother-in-law came to church with me, and she turned to me after the service and she said, "Kate, I got money out of the ATM this morning specifically to give to your church. What am I supposed to do with this?" Because there wasn't a time of offering during the service and no one told her how she could donate, she wasn't able to do it, even though she had felt called by God to do so. I think that for many of us, a time of offering went away during COVID for legitimate reasons, but we need to be bringing this back. Having a time of offering keeps giving as a main focus for us, but more importantly, it's also theologically necessary. We see it established as a worship practice in the New Testament, and we recognize that we give because we have been given to by God. So if we don't spend time in worship thinking about how we give back to God, then we aren't completing that circle. Even if most people give by standing order, we should still think about having a time of offering in place. I've heard of churches, for example, that might have a card in the pew that you place in the offering plate to indicate that you've given by standing order. Again, it's just about keeping it central in all of our minds. So the second thing that we should do in order to make sure that offering is easy for people is to have effective websites. So earlier this year, I did a survey of Church of Scotland websites, and I found that only 16% of church websites in any way talk about why you should give to the church. At an absolute minimum, I think that a church website should include information about how to give. That can just be by direct debit, or you can also include a link to the national donation page, and also an explanation of why you should give. I'm going to jump over to another slide for just a moment here. I pulled together a few examples of some church websites that I think are worth looking at. And again, we'll include links to these in the resources we send out afterwards. They come from a wide variety of churches in the US and the UK. What they all have in common is, first, they say that the reason you should give to the church is not because times have been hard, but rather to further God's work in the world. Second, their giving pages are easy to find. You don't have to. Third, they provide explanations of some different ways to give. So whether that's by credit or debit card, standing order, etc. And finally, some of them also point out that we not only can give our money, but also our time and our talents to the church. So again, I'd really encourage you to have a look at those websites after this evening. And then finally, in order to make it easy to give, we should also think a bit about digital giving. So that includes things like contactless devices, QR codes, donation pages, even text giving. The stewardship team has a lot of material on this. We did a webinar on it about a year ago, and we'll again be including a link to that. So in addition to making it easy for people to give, we also want to think about how we value our givers. I think most of us recognize that if somebody gives you a gift, it's rude not to thank them for that gift. I think in a Christian context, especially if we don't thank people for their offerings, we rob them of the spiritual development that comes from seeing how their gifts are used to further God's kingdom. So there are a few simple things that we can be doing here. First, if you use any kind of online donation platform, you can set it up to send automated thank yous when people make a donation. Second, for people who give regularly, you might send out an annual letter where you detail how much they've given and how that money's been used. I think as well, we should take the opportunities to explain to people how we use their donations. Think about that letter we get from the council, some of us, that gives a breakdown of how our taxes are used. Provide that kind of thing for your church members. And finally, wherever possible, point out when offerings have been critical in the success of your church. So let's say, for example, that you were posting on social media about a new mission initiative or refurbishments in the church. If offerings have been critical for making that succeed, then tell people that and let them know the impact that they're having. So I want to share an example of a church that I think approaches offerings and donations really well. So St. Andrew's Church in Arbroath is located in a deprived area, but people who attend the church give generously and they give consistently. In fact, they give not only to support their own church, but they've also given to projects abroad. They've been instrumental in building 2 orphanages in Malawi. And they've also given to support other churches as well. When I spoke to them, they shared a wonderful story of a time that they heard about a church in Glasgow that had all of their windows broken the night before by vandals. And in Sunday morning worship, Arbroath raised £2,000 on the spot to send to that church. I think what's key here is that their giving promotes discipleship. So they see a direct need, whether that be the church with the broken windows or children in Malawi, and they seek to answer it in a very concrete way. I think that kind of empathy and discernment is critical for us to practice as disciples. In addition, they have a very clear vision of the importance of their church in the community. They frame giving and serving as a privilege and as a blessing. They use that language all the time. What a privilege it would be if we were able to give. They also explain how their money is used. They speak in very concrete terms about money, in terms of exactly how much money is needed to run the church, to run certain programs. Doing so gives people a framework to start to envision the kind of impact that they personally can have in the life of the church. So in summary, I think it's really important that we review our offerings and our donations in the first instance to make sure that this area is strong and promotes a full and complete vision of stewardship and discipleship. So I want to turn next to talking about events. So events are a very popular way to raise money in the church, but I at least have been to a lot of events where the only people who show up are the people who themselves organized the event. I think that a lot of events fail because people don't ask the right questions before they plan an event. So I think before planning an event, it can be very helpful to go through this list and think about each of these items in turn. So the first thing I've put here, how will you market the event? I put this first because I would say this is one of the biggest pitfalls that I see for churches. Simply telling your members that an event is happening isn't going to cut it. So a few things that I think we can do in order to help promote our events in fairly simple ways. First, put out a local press release. Send a short article to your local newspaper, letting them know about your event. Second, post on local events pages. Most council websites have some kind of local events page, so put your items and your listings on there. Third, post on local Facebook pages. I've had previous roles in marketing and PR where I've had a lot of success posting about events on neighborhood groups, moms groups, just a variety of Facebook groups. I think as well, we can also think about paying for advertising. That sounds quite scary to a lot of people, but I've also found that paying for Facebook advertising is very cheap and very effective in getting the word out there. We're going to be sharing a little bit of guidance in our notes about how you can do that. Similarly, I think that flyering is another very effective method. You can get some simple A5 flyers printed up very cheaply and distribute them in the local neighborhood. And finally, I think it's really important to put together a list of other organizations and ask them to promote your event. So that might include other Church of Scotland churches, other ecumenical partners or mission partners, or even businesses in the local area. Email them or give them a call and ask them to share information. So we also need to think about what evidence we have that this event is desired by the community. I think this is another big pitfall. We often end up doing the sorts of events we want rather than what the community wants or needs. So for example, does having a coffee morning make sense if you're a church that's located on a busy high street where there are lots of coffee places? Or does it make sense to hold a fundraising event during the working day if that means that working age people aren't able to attend? Have you heard people in the community speak about a desire for more social engagement or maybe even a place to play with their kids? There's another example I like to share. I used to live up in Shetland and my husband was working at a leisure center. And one Saturday they put up a bouncy castle. That was it. It was just one bouncy castle and 300 people showed up. It's such a simple thing to do, but the response clearly shows that they hit some kind of need. So think about what is it that would have that sort of impact in your community. Next, think about what your goals are for the event. For our events to be a form of discipleship, we should think about them both as a way to raise money, but also as a way to make meaningful connections with people outside of the church. Our events can show that the church is a welcoming and an active place. But at the same time, if the purpose of the event is to raise money, then you should know how much you're aiming for and what your income goal is. Know how many attendees you would need in order to meet that income goal. Think as well about if there are any congregation members who have particular skills you can use. And also, is this going to be a regular or a one-off event? In the church, we often think about festivals or fates as kind of that's what springs to mind when we think about events. But I think there's a lot of advantage in having sorts of regular recurring events, as they often have lower overhead and they benefit from natural word of mouth. Think as well about if there's an opportunity to partner with other churches or organizations. Partnering with other people spreads the risk and increases the potential number of people supporting the event. The next one is really key. Think about if you've complied with regulations. At a bare minimum, every event should have a risk assessment performed for it. But depending on the type of event, you may also want to check your local council regulations. And if it's explicitly a fundraising event, then there is a body called the fundraising regulator that sets guidelines for that sort of thing. And again, we'll share a link to that. And then finally, think about how you're going to follow up with attendees. Have you given people the opportunity to learn more about your work and potentially to donate? Have they signed up potentially to receive information from you? I think we need to look at our events as the first part of an ongoing relationship. I used to work as a development manager at a museum here in Dundee, and I had a lot of success just sending around volunteers with a sign-up sheet where people could sign up to our newsletter. Again, it's just about building that relationship. So I want to share again a couple of examples of some churches that I think are doing this kind of thing really well. The first is Victoria Methodist Church in Bristol. So a few years ago, they needed to do some major refurbishments on the church. They recognized that their church was located in a neighborhood with a really strong arts and culture scene, and many people in the church were also involved in the arts. They therefore decided to design a very flexible space where they can now host a wide range of arts-related events. They've held exhibitions, performances, and they've worked with professional artists and touring exhibition providers to host a wide range of arts events. They say that their goal is to create gospel encounters through art. Their events are therefore both a financial enterprise, but also a spiritual enterprise. Again, it's about thriving for them and not just surviving. Another example I want to share is of St. Andrew's Church in Moffat. So at the moment, St. Andrew's are raising money for a major capital project. And in support of that, they've been hosting a wide range of events. When I spoke to them, they told me that their goal is not only to raise money, but also to engage diverse groups of people in the community. So quite cleverly, I think each of their events target a slightly different group of people. For example, they held a teddy bear festival, which maybe appeals to some families with younger children. They've held swap shops, which maybe appeals to younger adults. They had a Christmas tree festival, which was sponsored by local businesses. So again, it's about both engaging people financially, but also inviting them into the life of the church. So next, I want to talk a bit about property letting. Hall rentals are a really important source of income for many churches. And so it's worth considering how we can strengthen this element of our income while also making rentals a point of discipleship. We should think about both short-term and long-term rentals as an opportunity to give visitors from outside the church a warm welcome and to show the church's hospitality at its best. I do need to say, though, if you're considering any major developments in the area of rentals, it is essential that you speak to both the law department and to the general trustees, as there can be charitable and legal implications for certain types of rental activity. It's important, for example, that our rentals have a missional aspect and that fees are set at the right level. Moreover, the general trustees and the law department are there to support you, so make use of those resources. We should also note as well that any income from longer-term rental of properties that are owned by the general trustees will go into the Consolidated Fabric Fund. This can be accessed by congregations for building maintenance and improvements. The stewardship team held a webinar dedicated to this topic last year, and we'll include a link to a recording of this in the resources we share. In contrast, if a congregation owns a property directly, then income from the rental of that property will go directly to the congregation. But again, it's still critical to talk to the law department for advice. So again, a couple of quick case studies that I wanted to share. The first is of New Lake Kirk in Kilmarnock. So this church owns 2 high street shop fronts, which they rent out through a local estate agent. This provides them not only with regular income, but also a direct link to the center of the community. Another comes to us from St. Matthew's in Perth. So they have redeveloped a flat connected to the church into a holiday let. When I spoke to them, they told me that the income from this let was absolutely critical for sustaining them during the pandemic. And finally, I want to mention Fullerton. So Fullerton has recently redeveloped their church and their halls to create a space which provides different hall rentals to suit a variety of needs. So they say that they give priority to organizations who seek to help people in the wider community connect with one another. I've included them here because I think the way that they lay out information on their website about hall rentals is really attractive and professional, and it's worth taking a look at. So next, we're going to talk a bit about social enterprise and commerce. I think that there are lots of really exciting and innovative things being done in this area. But again, I want to preface this section by saying that if you're thinking about undertaking any work in this area, it's essential to speak to the law department, as again, there can be charitable and legal implications for some types of activity. But what exactly is a social enterprise? There are 4 criteria that define it. The first is that it is a trading enterprise that ideally has at least 50% of its income coming from commercial activity. Second, it has a social purpose over and above raising money. Part of this purpose can include support of a worshiping community. Third, the beneficiaries must be the wider community and not just individuals or a particular group. And fourth, there needs to be a recognized social enterprise legal structure. So, a few more case studies to share with you. The first is Greyfriars in Edinburgh. I think many of us will be familiar with Edinburgh Greyfriars and the Grassmarket Community Project, but I think it's a really key example to share. The Grassmarket Project is a social enterprise that was started by Greyfriars in 1982. It started with a project where vulnerable people volunteered to learn woodworking skills and make furniture out of recycled church pews. From there, it spun out to include a wide range of social enterprises, including a successful catering business and a cafe. A few weeks ago, I spoke to Richard Fraser, the minister at Greyfriars, and asked him what he thought made Grassmarket a success. He emphasized that having a clear, strong vision from the outset was critical for gaining support, particularly financial support. They put a lot of time and effort into making sure that they offered a unique and a wanted service in the area. I asked him as well why they pursued a social enterprise structure rather than a more traditional charity, which did not necessarily engage in commercial activity. He told me that they wanted to be free from the burden of constantly fundraising. So what he means is that even though they still have to apply for grant applications, the fact that the enterprise itself brings in income means that they can deliver a stronger and a more stable service. Another example from Edinburgh to share is St. John's Episcopal Church, which runs a fair trade store from the basement of their church. Again, this not only brings in income, but also models a more ethical and a more Christian approach to commerce. And then finally, I want to talk about St. Giles Church of England in Shipburn. So with only £500 startup costs, this church was able to start a successful weekly farmers market. So they now receive income from traders who pay for stands and also from their own church-run stands. I really like this example because it's from a rural church. I think that people in rural churches can get the idea that social enterprise is only accessible for urban churches who benefit from a lot of natural footfall. I think, however, that rural churches actually have advantages in some ways because there's less competition and overall a more obvious service need. Think about that bouncy castle in Shetland. There's not a lot of competition there. I've heard examples of churches who've started community shops in areas without a lot of local food provision, or laundrettes for communities that don't have a laundry service, or even youth camps in places where there's not a lot for children to do during school holidays. One of the resources I'll be sharing afterwards is a study that was done of rural churches who have started social enterprises. And if that applies to you, then I really encourage you to take a look at it. So we're going to turn now to talking about partnerships. This one's a little bit different because it overlaps with a lot of other income generation methods. But what do I mean by partnerships? Essentially, I'm talking about working with organizations outside of the church to support our mission in a variety of ways. Even though this webinar is about generating income, I think it's important to also think about partnerships and community working because they can be critical for making other types of fundraising succeed. So there are a few different ways that a business or an organization can support our church. First is by donating goods. So they could donate goods for missions such as food, building supplies, toys, etc. Second is by donating services. So a business can choose to donate their time and their expertise to support the development of mission activities. I've heard, for example, of businesses who have come forward and offered to redesign church websites. The next one is very straightforward. A business or an organization can donate a specified sum of money to support specific projects and activities. And finally, sometimes an organization and a church can establish a longer-term partnership through something like a social enterprise structure. I'll share an example of what that looks like in a moment. But how do we find people to partner with? I think first we need to be specific about what it is we need. So for example, do we need help with marketing, with building our website, with catering, with events management? Are there specific goods or services we need? But then from there are 3 other factors that we should look at before we approach people: affinity, inclination, and capacity. So affinity is essentially what connection we have to them. Maybe we're active in the same community, or we share mission goals, or maybe somebody from the organization attends the church. The second is inclination. Is there any kind of indication that they've given to organizations similar to your church in the past? Just because they haven't, it doesn't mean they won't support you, but if they have a history of giving to other organizations in the past, that makes them more likely to support you as well. And then finally is capacity. Essentially, is this organization in a thriving industry? Is there evidence that they're in a position where they're able to give of their time or of their money? And then finally, we also need to think about how we thank people. Just like with our regular givers, organizations might want to donate out of the goodness of their hearts, but I think they also want to project a certain image. That's why it's particularly important to thank them and to involve them in our work. So we might consider, for example, thanking them on social media or thanking them during a worship service. We could also arrange a thank you or an engagement visit for employees of the company. So again, it's really just about making sure that people know how we're using their money and that they feel valued for what they've given to us. So a few more case studies. The first is the Sheriff Center at St. James Church. So the Sheriff Center is located on the outskirts of London, and the local community was due to lose its only post office. When the vicar at St. James Church heard about this, he offered up the church as a potential new location for the post office. So the church now runs a post office branch out of the sanctuary of their church. From this, they've spun out to include a range of other social enterprises, including a soft play center, a cafe, and a debt advice service, all under the umbrella of what they call the Sheriff Center. I think what's important here, though, is that even though they have a post office and a soft play center in their church, they're still a church first and foremost. The front of the church is maintained as a worship space. And so people who come in see and understand that it is a church. And I think that that becomes a missional opportunity in and of itself, because people who go into the church to use the post office may never have otherwise stepped foot over the threshold. A very different example I want to share is of Dundonald Church here in Scotland. So Dundonald Church has had a lot of success in attracting support and service from non-church affiliated locals. So for example, the local pub donates pies and space for a monthly ministry initiative. The church found that on Sunday mornings, they didn't have enough space for all their activities. And so the hairdresser across the street lets them use her shop front for some extra space. They've had locals who've offered to redesign their website or assist with grant applications. So again, although none of these are direct income per se, it's freed them up from spending their own money in certain cases. I asked the minister, how have you been so successful in developing this outreach and these partnerships? And she said that a lot of it is just being willing to ask. When you articulate a need and when you invite people to share in your vision, then many of them are willing to do so. You just have to be willing to ask. I've heard anecdotal examples from lots of other churches as well. So there's a farm in Angus that gives to a number of church food projects. I've heard of plenty of grocery stores who support mission initiatives. I've even heard of a church that has a local GP's office built into an unused part of their complex. So I think that there are a lot of exciting ways that we can think about working with other people to further our vision of the kingdom. So I'm going to go fairly quickly through the next few methods of income generation. The first is selling assets. So this can't always be relied upon as a regular source of income, but if your church has unused goods, you can think about selling them through services such as eBay or Facebook Marketplace. We've included a bit of guidance about how to do that as well. I've heard of one church in Brewery West who during lockdown started an eBay store where members of the church donate their good quality unused goods. and a member of the church simply lists them on the eBay store. And to date, this has made over £7,000 for the church with very little upfront investment. The next one to talk about are trusts and grants. Again, these aren't the best for running costs. They tend to be better for specific projects and for getting other methods of income generation up and running. I want to note again that trusts and grants are all about relationship building. It's important that we think about how we follow up with funding bodies and show them how we're using their money. But there are a few resources that I wanted to share here. Just a moment. The first is that the Church of Scotland has a dedicated grants manager who is available to help with finding funding applications. The second is that most councils have what's called a voluntary sector interface. So this is a body that works with different voluntary organizations in the community. They can be a really good source of funding and of support. Next is funding.scot. This is the main database that's used for finding funders for Scottish-based charities and churches. And finally is just the Scottish Charities Regulator, OSCAR. I find it can be very useful if you're thinking about making an application to look for that funder on OSCAR and see who they've given to in the past and how much they've given. It can really help you in terms of developing a sort of guideline for how you approach them. And then finally, I just want to mention investments. So the Church of Scotland Investors Trust provides a simple way for churches to invest their funds. There's some different funds available that can help to provide a return on that investment. And we've included a link both here and in the notes. So now that we have some ideas of the kinds of fundraising activities that we might be able to engage in as a church, how can we actually apply this to our own context? Oh, there we go. I think it's really important that we have a strategy. It's so easy to get bogged down in the kinds of day-to-day matters in the church that we lose focus on our overall vision. We need to make sure that any activities we are doing are part of our broader mission to grow disciples and not simply the result of a desperate sort of scramble for cash. Again, thriving, not surviving. I think as well, doing fundraising well as a church requires a shifting of prioritization. Fundraising can't just be something peripheral that we do only when we're cash strapped. We have to think about raising money for ministry and practicing good stewardship as an essential part of our mission and our life as a church. Developing an income generation strategy is essentially a process of asking the following three questions. First, where are we now? Second, where do we want to be? And third, how will we get there? So on that first question, before we can turn to new ways of fundraising, we need to understand what is and is not working about what we're doing at the moment. So we need to first figure out where our money is currently coming from, who's giving to us. In addition to offerings and donations, what other money are we receiving? Once we have that full picture, then we should look at the following areas. First, our past successes and failures. So what fundraising in the past has worked and what hasn't? Who is currently involved in fundraising and income generation? Do we have a team dedicated to stewardship? And are we missing any sorts of key skill sets? Who's currently giving us money? This includes both, again, offerings, but also more general donations. The next one's really key. What is our attitude towards money in the church? Do we talk about money? Do we think about giving as a positive part of our spiritual lives, or as just a necessary but unpleasant activity? Do we have appropriate policies in place for handling donations? And do we have a website? Is it easy for people to find out information about us? And finally, is our church valued in the wider community? Do people care about the well-being of the church? If the church were to close tomorrow, would that have an impact? I think as you look at these questions, it'll become clear that our success at fundraising is directly tied to other aspects of our discipleship, such as our outreach, our mission, and our worship. So don't be afraid to talk about any of these aspects of church life as they arise. So once we've considered what our current practice looks like, we ask the question, where do we want to be? That is, what is God's vision for our church and for our work in the community? As part of this, we need to consider the wants, the needs, and the trends in the communities around us and in wider society. Any fundraising we undertake should be achieving other objectives, such as expanding our spiritual commitment as Christians or extending our mission. So think about the following. What strengths do we have as a church? What can we offer people? Why should they support us or be involved with our work? I think so much about what an issue loneliness and isolation is. And I think the church has such a powerful role to play and has so much to offer in helping people find fellowship and connection. So think about those strengths and what you have to give. Also think about what the needs of the community are. Do people lack certain goods or services? Do they need fellowship? Do they need childcare? What factors in the community present opportunities or threats? Are there big changes happening in the community? Maybe there's a development being built. Who else is doing good work in our community? This might include churches or other secular organizations. I think we can often be tempted to simply duplicate the good work that other people are already doing. But instead, we should look for opportunities to collaborate and for all of us to grow together. Think as well, are there any trends that you're seeing in terms of fundraising? Have you seen anything that you've been really inspired by? And finally, think about who else in the community, apart from members, is invested in the mission of the church, and how do we strengthen their support and their engagement? I think here it can be really useful to look at steeple factors. So a steeple analysis is a tool for helping to analyze the context of our individual church. It's an acronym that stands for social, technological, economic, environmental, political, legal, and ethical. So as a team, what we do is we look at each of these factors in turn and consider emerging trends in each category. We then think about how each factor might impact society and imagine how our future mission and fundraising will fit into that context. So some examples for each. So under social, as I said before, we might think about widespread loneliness and isolation. We might think about social trends emerging from the pandemic, or the fact that Scotland has an aging population. How as a church might we be able to help address those issues? Technological. We see a big rise in working from home. There's also greater digital connectivity and a shift to cashless payments. Can the church be utilizing technology in any way to support fundraising? Economic, cost of living crisis. We're all very aware of that. But there's also a growing wealth gap, and many people also struggle with debt. How can we provide support for that? Environmental. Are there ways potentially that the church can help with sustainability, maybe helping people reuse or repair their goods? Or maybe the church can offer a green space that people can gather in. Political. Lots of political divides in the country. Have politics in any way affected our ability to engage civilly? What kinds of justice issues are at stake? Think about that and how your church can address that. Legal, new laws coming into play, refugees coming into communities, people facing legal troubles, all things that the church can help with. Ethical, lots of issues in our society around identity and lots of different social justice concerns. Think about what you're seeing in your community and how the church can respond. So finally, once we have some ideas based on that for ways of generating income, we should go through the following checklist for each idea. First, who needs to be involved? What role or activity will they undertake? Second, is this new income generating activity appropriate for both our current supporters and for the people we wish to attract? Are we able to achieve other objectives in addition to raising money, such as expanding mission and outreach? Is it something that's attractive and appealing? Is it something that we can easily promote? Think as well about what else you need in terms of resources, materials, literature. Are there opportunities for partnership here? How will you evaluate the effectiveness of the project? What's your income goal? In addition to income, are there other things you're going to think about when you decide whether or not your project was successful? And finally, does the expected income justify the expenditure of time and money? So I'm going to go over to the next slide to talk about that a little bit more. So this is a chart that I also think is useful. I think in the church, we can often find ourselves putting a lot of effort into things that don't necessarily have a high impact in terms of either money or service. So as you go through each of your ideas, think about where they might fall on this chart. So let's take the bouncy castle again. Low effort, high impact. We can consider that low-hanging fruit. Something like a social enterprise might require a lot of effort, but might also have a high impact. So we might want to approach that really strategically and think about it. I think it's important to consider this chart when you're project planning, because we're called to steward our time and our resources as well as our money. And then finally, make a plan for pursuing each new idea. So identify a timeline, the people who need to be involved, what resources you need, and what roles people will undertake. So in this webinar, we've talked first about how fundraising is a way of inviting people into our shared vision for God's kingdom. We've also talked about how different specific methods of fundraising can provide opportunities for the church not only to survive, but to thrive. And then finally, we've looked at how we can start to develop a strategy. We recognize that Christ calls us to discern how these opportunities answer the gospel's call to service in our communities. Before we close, I want to encourage you again to please get in touch with the stewardship team if you're interested in learning about anything we've talked about today. You know, the team is there to help congregations approach their income in an informed way. So please make use of us. But I think if there's anything that I really want us to take away, it's that fundraising is fundamentally a call to conversion. Through fundraising, we practice evangelism by sharing the good news of what God is doing through us in our communities. We as Christians recognize that Christ answers our challenges, our thirst, with abundant life. When we approach income generation as discipleship, then all are called into a new, more spiritual relationship with their needs and with their resources. Throughout our challenges, the Spirit presents us with new ways of making Christ known and transforming lives. Are we willing to answer that call by creating a thriving and an abundant church? So with that in mind, we are going to turn to some questions.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you for your presentation and for everything you've shared with us. Lots of food to get everyone thinking. We now have around 20 minutes to answer your questions. Just a reminder, if you move your mouse or tap your screen, there will be a button that says Q&A. You can click on that, type in a question and press submit, and we'll do our very best to answer it. There are a few questions that have come in during the presentation, so we'll kick off with one of those. Derek Stephen asks, will you provide a data protection statement for use when we look at asking people to sign up for newsletters or funding activities? Pauline, I wonder if you could take this one. We have a dedicated member of staff in the national office who could maybe help, don't we?
Yes, that's right. Alice Wilson works within the law department. She is great at just keeping us right in terms of what we should be doing in terms of data protection. Even for this event tonight, the data protection statement, which you would have received in one of our emails through Eventbrite, was guided in terms of content by Alice. So what we'll do is we'll speak to Alice. We'll get some guidance from her, which we'll include in the material that comes out to you after this event. Clearly, the guidance will need to, it'll depend on what kind of event you're having or what kind, a newsletter, what you're proposing, how you're going to hold information, what you're going to do with it. So there wouldn't be a one shape statement for everybody, but Alice will certainly be able to give us some guidance. I don't know if anyone else in the panel wants to add to that.
Thank you. A nice straightforward question here from Sandra Wright. When we send the link, is it only the registered person who can watch, or can it be shared with others? The link to the recording will be hosted on our YouTube page. So that will be a link you can share as widely as you like and encourage people in your congregation to watch along and maybe kick off a little conversation locally. We have a question from Willie Mackay, who asks, having a church that is registered with Historic Scotland restricts potential developments that could provide another income stream. Can the Church of Scotland work to soften these restrictions? Brian, I wonder, do you, from a general trustee's perspective, have any take on relationships such as Historic Scotland?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yeah, and thanks, Willie, for the question. We've got a very strong relationship with them. There are two sides to this. We're bound by the ecclesiastical exemption in the Planning Acts with listed church buildings. We've got, which is a bit of a leg up for the church. We can do what we wish with interiors of churches under a denominational planning scheme, as long as we, along with other denominations, so long as we do things sensitively. And particularly with A and B listed churches which have listed interiors, we control that through one of my colleagues, our Sanctuary Development Officer, Judith Roebuck. So Willie's right. If a church is listed in the scheme, the grading scheme or the listing scheme, it is a bit more difficult to do stuff other than coming through the general trustees in terms of advice, etc. That's why Judith's there. So I would encourage that there's lots of ways we can help with that. Judith spends a great deal of her time advising congregations on how to deal with interiors of listed churches, and indeed any church, but particularly Willie's questions, particularly about listed churches. There are things that can be done, and we offer guidelines, guidance, and assistance on that in terms of what would be appropriate without actually having to go to the planning department of a local authority. It's really done through the GT offices. So I would really encourage folks to get in touch with us, and we'll pass those sorts of questions on to my colleague Judith Roebuck, who can assist. And Judith is ex-Historic Scotland herself, so really knows the P's and Q's on that one.
And we'll include those contact details in the follow-up material as well for you. A question from Sandra Wright, who asks, does the Church of Scotland have a resource which could facilitate a discussion around strategy, particularly around the where do we want to be slide? There are a number of answers we could give to that, but the stewardship team, that's what we do day in, day out. So please get in touch with your local stewardship consultant and we can help you with that. We have a resource called the Narrative of Generosity, which has a variety of themes to help you do that. And one of those themes is vision. And we have materials to help you begin a discussion in your congregation on that very thing. And we can also provide worship material, Bible study material, personal devotional material, material you can use to involve children, young people, intergenerational events, and so on the theme as well. If you'd like to go a little bit further than that, we can come along to your congregation and offer a facilitated day conference where we have a look at where you would like to be and what the first steps would be in getting there. So I don't know if any colleagues want to chip any more in on that, but please do get in touch with us for a conversation. We have a question from Bruce. If we sell a capital item like a redundant church, can those monies be ring-fenced for our parish to use, or at least the interest from it? Again, Brian, I'm going to come to you.
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks, Dan. So thanks, Bruce, and for the benefit for everybody who's just a bit wary about the regulations surrounding this. When a capital item, a heritable property like a church, gets sold and the building is in the name of the general trustees, although it's held on behalf of the congregation in terms of they're the beneficiary owners, that money finds its way to the Consolidated Fabric Fund. That's a restricted fund. It's legally restricted, and we're duty bound by trusteeship duties in terms of the charity regulations, etc. And it's restricted for the use of or to be used for fabric purposes in the future. However, there are other ways and means that the fact that the Consolidated Fabric Fund can assist with non-fabric items, one of which is, for example, if a congregation has in excess of £50,000 held in its revenue account in the Consolidated Fabric Fund, some of that money can be used for non-fabric items with the approval of the Presbytery. Additionally, revenue in the Consolidated Fabric Fund can be put towards the reimbursement of things like utility items and insurance. Now, that's not of its own a type of an outreach thing, but it does free up local monies for what might be outreach. But in terms of strict capital for GT-owned buildings, that money is legally restricted for the use of project and maintenance work on remaining buildings in the future. What I would say is you need to check, if you wanted to check with us, you can do that about how the buildings are held. Most of the buildings are held in the name of the General Trustees. Some are held locally. And if that's the case, then the money is available locally, but at the direction of the Presbytery. In other words, the Presbytery will help you decide what needs to happen with that, what's an approved use. That wouldn't involve the General Trustees. But heritable property is the capital derived from the sale of heritable property is broadly reserved for expenditure on items to do with that property in the future, or remaining property, whether it's maintenance or whether it's a capital project of that nature.
Around a year ago, we held a webinar on getting the most out of the Consolidated Fabric Fund. So we can also include a link to that so that if you do have holdings in the Consolidated Fabric Fund, you're putting them to best use. I think you touched there, Brian, on our next question as well. Eileen Bishop asks, what are the advantages, if any, of a congregation owning its building, and how can that be established?
Yeah, thanks, Darren, and thanks, Eileen. You wouldn't surprise me to hear me say this, that there are actually more benefits to not owning your own property than there are to having your own. And one of the reasons for that is that congregations who have their own property in title, where we don't have what we call the assembly control clause in the title, which gives the GTs some measure of control and disposal, if those congregations who have entirely their own buildings locally held legally, and that makes up a small 3 or 4% of the entire estate, none of those congregations, in terms of those buildings, are eligible to apply for grants from the General Trustees to assist with works to the buildings. In terms of church and assembly legislation that pertains to buildings, there is no difference at all. The same regulations and the same obligations on congregations are applied whether those buildings are held locally or held in the name legally by the General Trustees, although with the congregations being the beneficiaries. So I would argue it's quite the opposite. That we every year we get applications from congregations. Could you please switch our titles to the name of the General Trustees to allow us to make applications for grants for works to buildings, of a nature of a maintenance or project work. Beyond that, the only difference will be if a building gets sold which is locally owned, as Kitty turned implied in the beginning of the webinar. The money, the sale proceeds, can go back to the local account rather than the Consolidated Fabric Fund. That is absolutely the case. However, it's usually at the direction of the Presbytery what happens to that fund, or what happens to that money. Beyond that, the building, the congregation, howsoever the buildings are held, it's the same obligations and responsibilities on those buildings, whether it's a manse church or hall, that you have, however they're held legally. And as I say, I would argue that it's actually more advantageous and beneficial to have the buildings held in the name by the General Trustees in title, because those congregations are eligible to make grant applications for works to those buildings.
Thanks. Peter Murdoch has raised a couple of issues. He says, encouraging, very positive presentation, but I assume we also need to factor in the Giving to Grow impact of the income. And then is also asking, recalling a letter from the General Trustees around bouncy castles and insurance and health and safety implications around that. I wonder if we could look at the Giving to Grow question first. Anne, do you want to speak to that one? Oh, you'll need
And you're
to.
on mute. Sorry.
Thank you. Sorry, more used to Teams. Yes, the Giving to Grow scheme was introduced with a view to allowing congregations to actually grow their income, just as we've been talking about tonight. The system is not like, it's different from the old system, and the aim is that more of the income that you're able to grow is able to stay locally, and you can work with Presbytery on different schemes and so forth. But yes, it could increase your Giving to Grow amount. On the other hand, that is capped at the cost of a minister. But Lisa would be able to advise, Lisa Erskine can advise you on any specifics about your congregation and how you'd be affected. But as I say, we do encourage you to grow the income. That's what it's all about. So don't know if you want to add anything, Lisa.
Yeah, just to say, Peter, that there are tools on the website. We've run webinars previously, but there are tools on the website as well. We can maybe include that link that will allow you to do some scenario planning around, you know, growth in income as well, and how that will affect the Giving to Grow contribution.
Thank you both. Any comment around bouncy castles and advice around that at all? We'll maybe point you to some advice and circulars that are on the website and the follow-up materials for that. Also thinking around events, Jack Kernahan has asked, where an event such as a coffee morning or praise evening does not charge for entry, but invites a free will offering, can tax be recovered under the Gift Aid Small Donations Scheme? Fiona, do you want to take that one?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Jack, for your question. If you have such an event and you invite donations, so there is an expectation that people will give something, then no, you can't claim. However, if the event is completely free to enter, and people can choose if they wish to give a donation, then yes, you could claim that under the Gift Aid Small Donation Scheme, but not if there's an expectation to give something, whether it's the value of what they're getting or not. If there's an expectation, then no, you can't, but otherwise, yes, you can. Yeah.
Thank you. Jim asks, do you have any examples of strategic plans for fundraising which have previously been prepared by other churches? Kate, do you want to say something around strategic plans for fundraising?
Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely have examples of strategic plans for non-church affiliated organizations, but I think what you're pointing to there, Jim, is a really excellent point, that perhaps something the stewardship team could look to develop is a sort of outlined strategic plan for congregations. So if that's something that, you know, you're interested in, we can absolutely take a look at that. But again, similarly, if you're interested in more detailed guidance around strategic planning, then that's something that we can also dedicate some time to talking about. Anne?
Yeah, I was just going to say that other people will be more than happy to speak to you as well. So some of the people that you've talked about tonight, Kate, I'm sure would be happy to share things, other people in your own presbytery and so forth. But you usually find people who've done this kind of thing love talking about it. So you ask for help from other people who've done it already.
Thank you. Ewart Mackenzie asks, do you have a list of companies which are off limits for partnerships? For example, arms manufacturers, tobacco companies, and so on. Anne, I wonder if you could take that one.
Yeah, sure. We don't have a list as such. The church, the central church, if you like, doesn't invest in particular ones. You've mentioned armaments, tobacco, there's gambling, alcohol, and thermal coal extraction. So these are the main ones that are excluded from the investments, but it would really be up to each congregation to set its own ethical policy. And you can always also, for any company that you're thinking of dealing with or going into partnership with, you could look up their website, and you should look up their ESG policy. So that's their environmental, social and governance policy. And they should all have one. Certainly all the big companies will have one. And you can read about what are how they're dealing with environment and so forth. It's a good question. It does make me think about something else, and that's when you're receiving donations or anything like that. you should know who your donors are. That's important too. And the Oscar website's got good guidance about that. And actually that leads you onto the Charity Commission's website, which is probably a little bit better in that respect. So, you know, you might have your ethics about who you actually receive donations from. Don't know if you wanted to add anything there, Kate?
Yeah. Just to say that, you know, earlier in the presentation, I mentioned the fundraising regulators. So they also set some regulations for that kind of thing. So we've included a link to them, but they're, you know, if you go to any sort of section about partnerships, they'll also be able to point you towards those things that Anne mentioned.
Thank you. We have one more question in the Q&A so far, and that's from Alan Sinclair, who says, we make extensive use of QR codes for missional activities and for general fundraising. I was just wondering, are we okay in terms of conforming to data protection by advertising this on our websites and Facebook pages? Again,
yeah. I was just going to say, so the QR code itself is fine, but you know, in terms the QR code will direct to a certain web page. So if, say, for example, you were using the QR code to direct to a newsletter sign up, then you would need your data protection statement listed on that sign up. So the QR code itself is fine, but you know, think about data protection in terms of whatever it is that you are linking to. Does anybody else have anything to add to that?
Fiona?
Yeah, I just might add a little in that if you're using it for fundraising, then you'll have signed up with a provider, so they should have their data protection policies and statements as part of that. But it's always best to check before you get into any kind of agreement with a provider and that they actually conform to what we suggest is suitable. So yeah.
Those are all of the questions we've had so far in the Q&A. If after tonight you suddenly think of a question and wish you had asked it, please get in touch with us. You can email it to stewardship@churchofscotland.org.uk. But if there are no more questions coming in, I'll hand over to Pauline.
Thanks, Darren, and thanks again to Kate for the main presentation tonight, and to our panelists for your time and input. I have put the link in the chat facility to the short survey. So before you log off from here tonight, I wonder if if everyone would just click on that link so that you've got that survey open, and you can just quickly take a couple of minutes to complete that before you log off of your computer for the evening. Thanks again for joining us tonight. I think we had as many as 240 here, with another 80 people registered, so they'll be able to catch up afterwards. It's really good to know that you're engaging and that the material and the events we're hosting are of interest, but that will only continue to be the case if you keep telling us what you need. So if you are able to fill in that survey, that would be really great. So I think that's everything. We'll be in touch in the next week with feedback from this event, with links to some of the information that Kate has referred to. We will go through those Q&As again and just type out the answers and add a bit more to it where required. And we'll send you the slides from tonight as well, because I think there was a lot of really helpful content there. And again, we would just encourage you to get in touch with us. We would like to do a bit more in-depth work on a one-to-one with congregations, and it allows us to do work that we can't do in this format. So don't ever hesitate to phone us up for a chat to see how we can help you. So I wish you a good evening, and we'll see you again soon. Good night.